Welcome back to our continuing Bible study series on the life lessons that we can learn from the life of David. So last Sunday morning, we learned from the life of David in 1 Samuel chapters 18 through 23 biblical principles how to deal with difficult people. And that's something that we all have to do with. I mean, unfortunately, in this world, there's always difficult people. Sometimes these difficult people may be at work or school or while shopping. It can be friends or even family, and sometimes even at church. But if we desire to be Christians after God's own heart, we must absolutely learn how to deal biblically with these difficult people in our lives. So the three biblical principles for dealing with difficult people are to remember why people are difficult. Again, it's insecurity, jealousy, and fear. We must retain a sense of humor, and we must refuse to be revengeful. Remember, vengeance is the Lord's, and that's always one of the hardest parts. We want to see what we call justice. It's really not justice. We want revenge whenever we are wronged, but that's not our job. In fact, and according to John chapter 15 and verse 12, Christ Jesus gives us a new commandment. So our job is that ye love one another as I have loved you. So our job is to love others with the love of Christ. Let God worry about revenge if that's what you're most interested in. But we, the recipients of the greatest forgiveness this world has ever known, should be the greatest sharers of that forgiving towards others. Whatever wrong they have done you, whether it was intentional or not, it doesn't matter. In the greater scheme of things, Christ looked at your life and all the things you have done wrong, and He forgave you to the point of giving His own life for you. We should also have that same type of love and forgiveness for everyone else in our lives. It's not always easy. But through Christ, it can be. Now, this Sunday morning, we are continuing our continuing Bible study series on the life lessons that we can learn from the life of David in 1 Samuel chapter 21 and 22, as we learn three biblical principles for what to do when you falter in your faith. When you falter in your faith. Now, what do you do when you falter in your faith and you fall into sin? Even the greatest of believers at times falter in their faith sometimes, and God's holy word does not hide from us the faults and failures of these larger-than-life heroes of the faith documented throughout God's holy word, and especially in the Old Covenant. We can see their faults and just in black and white for us all to see. And I don't think anyone in here would like, when after we're gone and people are talking about us, that hopefully they're not focused on our faults and failures. Hopefully they can focus on and remember those good things that we have done. But God didn't do it that way. God made sure that we can see the faults and failures of these heroes of the faith so that we can learn from those mistakes. We don't have to repeat those mistakes in our own lives. We can learn how to be more Christ-like by reading about those who have already made mistakes and gone before us. And of course, David was no exception. As David fled away from Saul, who was determined to murder David, he demonstrated human frailty at its finest and faltered and failed in his faith. It is from this chapter in David's life that we will learn this morning three biblical principles for when we falter in our own faith, just like David did. And the first is to quickly and simply confront the cause. Now in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 9, God's holy word declares, "Then came David to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, Why art thou alone, and no man with thee? And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee, and I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. Now therefore, what is under thine hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present. And the priest answered David and said, There is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, Of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave David hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. And David said unto Ahimelech, And is there not here under thine hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it, for there is no other save that here. And David said, There is none like that. Give it me. So after his moving farewell to his best friend Jonathan, David fled to Nob, about 2 miles northeast of Jerusalem, where the tabernacle was located at that time. So David traveled there to seek help from the high priest Ahimelech. When David arrived, Ahimelech was suspicious because Israel's most famous warrior was without his customary escort. So Ahimelech asked David why he was alone, and David lied to the high priest that Saul had dispatched David on a secret mission. Now David's lie began a chain reaction with horrible consequences. When tempted to lie, remember God's truth as recorded in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 19. The lip of truth shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. You know, we need to keep that in mind. It's easy when we are in a bind to come up with a lie. Satan will give you all kinds of lies that you can tell to get out of whatever situation you're in. But, you know, there's an old saying, what goes around comes around, and when you start off with lies, it will come back to you, and not in a pleasant way either. But a lie may get you out of trouble temporarily, but the fix created by that lie will not last, as David quickly learned. Frightened, tired, and hungry, David asked for 5 loaves of bread and anything else available to eat. But the only bread available was the hallowed bread, or the showbread, also called the bread of the presence in Exodus chapter 25, verse 30. The showbread was removed from the holy place in the tabernacle and replaced with fresh bread every Sabbath, and was only to be eaten by the priests. So David was also unarmed, so he asked Ahimelech for a weapon. Now once again, David lied, claiming that the king's business was so urgent that David did not have time to grab anything, such as weapons. So Ahimelech gave David the only weapon available, Goliath's sword. Now Goliath's sword should have been a reminder for David of God's power and faithfulness. Yet, because David feared Saul more than he feared God, David forgot all about his miraculous victory over the giant. You know, we all have weaknesses that make us vulnerable to sin. So one of the first things we should do when guilty of sin is to find the cause. The cause of David's sin was fear. Other causes of sin include discouragement, inappropriate relationships, greed, lust, and I can go on and on. It's easy when we allow a weakness in our faith to remain. It is easier still, though, to give it to God and let God strengthen your faith. And unfortunately, here we see David's weakness. Fear overtook him, and he ends up lying to the high priest, not just once, but twice. And in the process, he was able to get Goliath's sword back. I guess that's a good thing. But he removed the hallowed or holy bread from God's holy tabernacle that was reserved for God and the priests, and he took it for himself. David's lies may have provided him temporary security and food, but they soon brought him humiliating disgrace and much worse. So when you falter in your faith, confront the cause and then avoid the sin. But also consider the consequences. So in 1 Samuel chapter 21, continuing verses 10 through 15, David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul hath slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? And David laid up these words in his heart and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And David changed his behavior before them and feigned himself mad in their hands and scrabbled on the doors of the gate and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, ye see the man is mad, wherefore then have ye brought him to me? Have I need of madmen that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? From Nob, we see that David fled to Gath, the hometown of Goliath. Now, that sounds a little like the wrong place to be. Surely they would hate David, and if they see him, they're going to hurt David, probably kill him, and probably slowly, just to make sure he remembers it. But David probably figured that this would be the last place Saul would look for him. Well, yeah, who's going to expect you to run to a place that wants to kill you? However, the Philistines, obviously, they recognized David, who became very afraid of what Achish might do to him. So David pretended to be crazy in hopes that they would maybe just leave him alone. They're not going to fear a crazy person, and you don't punish a guy who doesn't even know who he is or whatever. So they see him, and it works. It's a shameful scene, though. The greatest warrior and hero of Israel was acting like a lunatic. But David's humiliating act worked, and his life was spared. But this was not the worst consequence of David's sin. We see in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 9 through 19, that Doug, Saul's chief herdsman, recognized David at Nob and reported back to Saul, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for David, and gave David victuals, and gave David the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. So now Saul knows what happened out there in Nob. So Saul, in a fit of rage, sent for Ahimelech and all his sons, who were also priests. And upon their arrival, Ahimelech and his sons were probably stood before Saul in their priestly attire designed by God. I know I would have. See me not as just a person, but as the priest of the holy God. So they're now standing there in front of Saul, dressed in their, if you will, their royal attire, in the priests of the Lord. And Saul accused Ahimelech, Why have ye conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given David bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him, that David should rise against me to lie in wait, as at this day? To which Ahimelech replied, And who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me, let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father. For thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. Ahimelech obviously thought that he was honoring Saul by helping David, one of Saul's most fabled servants. However, Saul had allowed his jealousy, anger, and hatred to fester in his heart until he had lost all sense of right and wrong. It didn't matter that this guy was doing what was right as far as the king should have been concerned. Saul was too deep into hatred to listen to reality. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 16 and 17, The king said, Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. And the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, Turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not show it to me. But I like how verse 17 ends. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. Smart men. They knew that Saul was wrong, and it was a sin to commit such murder. But this was such an obvious sin and sacrilegious act of blasphemy. So his own royal guards would not obey the king. So Saul ordered Doeg, an Edomite and foreigner, who apparently did not fear God, to kill all the defenseless priests. And as ordered, Doeg murdered 75 persons that did wear a linen ephod. The linen, the linen ephod being the priestly garment, and that's 75 being 85 priests that were murdered that day. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 22 and verse 19, Doeg in Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. Now this sin just got even worse. He just murdered a whole town of innocent people. Why? Out of the jealousies where this started of Saul toward David. David later wrote Psalm 52 as an indictment of Doeg's sin. But for David's own lies, this great sin against God's priests would have probably never even happened. This is all because David lied to a high priest. Your sin affects more than just you. In fact, sometimes it only takes just the sin of just one person to cause a lifetime of pain for many people. As such, it is essential to consider the consequences of your sin before taking the next step. So when you falter in your faith, confront the cause and consider the consequences, and finally, confess your sin. So in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 through 5, God's holy word declares, David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. And every one that was in distress, and every one that was in debt, and every one that was discontented, gathered themselves unto David. And David became a captain over them, and there were with David about 400 men. And David went thence to Mizpeh of Moab, and he said unto the king of Moab, Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you, till I know what God will do for me. And David brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. And the prophet Gad said unto David, Abide not in the hold, depart and get thee into the land of Judah. Then David departed and came into the forest of Hareth. So leaving Gath, David fled to a cave in Adullam, about 12 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It was only about 2 miles south of the valley where David had slain Goliath. In that lonely cave, as David reflected on his sin, he came to his senses and was spiritually revived. And as a result, David later wrote Psalm 34 and 142. In desperation, David stated in 142 and verse 1, I cried unto the Lord with my voice. With my voice unto the Lord did I make my supplication. He is in a bad place. And so what does he do? He cries unto God in prayer. That's something that we all should be doing, preferably before you get into such a bad place. But then continuing in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 20 through 23, God's holy word declares, And one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard. So Abiathar, a son of Ahimelech, escaped the massacre in Nob and fled to join David and told him what happened to his family. David never intended his sin to have such serious consequences, but no one ever does. But feeling the guilt of his sin, David immediately confessed, telling Abiathar, I knew it that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul. And he continues, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. What a difficult confession to make to the person whose whole family was murdered because of your sin. I cannot really comprehend it, but I can compare it to something that happens all too often here in America. Some knucklehead goes out, gets drunk, and then while drunk drives, killing some innocent person. Imagine, if you will, having then to face the family of the individual you murdered because of your sinful drunkenness. That cannot be an easy place to be. And you've probably seen some of the videos of people when they do so. The majority of them break down in horrible tears of guilt and shame for what their sin caused to another family. We can avoid that by avoiding the sin to begin with. But David's confession reveals two things about true confession. First of all, confession must be personalized. David did not make excuses or claim to be a victim of circumstances. David did not play the blame game either. He didn't say, well, it's all Saul's fault. If he's the one who murdered them, and if he weren't chasing me, I wouldn't have had to run there. He didn't do any of that. David accepted his personal responsibility for his sin. David was a great confessor because he always personalized his personal sin. For example, consider what David prayed in Psalm 32 and verse 5. I acknowledged my sin unto thee, and mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess my transgressions unto the Lord, and thou forgavest the iniquity of my sin. Selah. David, 8 times in that one verse, used first-person pronouns to personalize his sin. I, my, mine, I, my. I acknowledged my sin, and mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess my transgressions unto the Lord, and thou forgavest the iniquity of my sin. He personalized the sin. Now, the Hebrew word translated sin in the Old Covenant is kind of a general word to describe any offense against God. Iniquity is more specific, though, and refers to perverting what is good, which David did by deceiving the high priest. And then transgressions mean to revolt and go beyond the limits of God's law. David was guilty of all 3 of these categories of sin and personalized all 3 in his confession. So confession of sin must be personalized. If not, it is just an excuse. But confession must also be verbalized. Confession must be verbalized to God because only He can forgive our sin. Exactly what are we to verbalize? Well, David answered that question for us in Psalm 38 and verse 18. For I will declare mine iniquity, I will be sorry for my sin. We must verbally confess our sin and honestly express our shame for our sin. We do not confess just to clear the slate so we can do it again. If we are truly sorry for our sin, we will not repeat it. That's the hard part. We like to, I'll use the Catholics as an example. Growing up Catholic-like, my wife grew up full-blood Catholic. It's simple. You sin all you want, and then you go see the priest, and he tells you, well, just say a couple Hail Marys and maybe a Our Father, and you're good to go. And then they go and they say the little prayers. They And then they commit the same sins and come back the next week and confess their sin to the priest who allegedly absolves them of their sin, but he has no power to do so. What good is saying these Hail Marys and Our Father if you're still repeating the same sin? Have you repented at all from your sin? Of course not. You haven't done anything except pray to a dead woman who has zero power to do anything for anyone. But we Christians are not much different. If we simply pray a brief prayer but then go on and commit the same sin again, we are basically lying to God. And as we saw from what happened when David lied to Ahimelech, the high priest of God, there are consequences for that sin. But if we are truly sorry for our sin, we can confess that sin to God and confess our shame or our sorriness for that sin, and then go and sin no more. Finally, David pledged to protect the high priest's only surviving son, Abiathar, who would become one of David's most trusted friends. So now David had Goliath's sword to remind him of God's faithfulness, and Abiathar to remind him of the consequences of his sin. For the rest of his life, every time David saw Abiathar, David would be constantly reminded of the horrible, horrible consequences of his sin. Though God totally forgave him, David had to live the rest of his life with the memories and consequences of how his sin affected others. Consider how David expressed the memory of his sin in Psalm 51 and verse 2. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. He will never be able to forget the consequences of a simple little lie. It will be with him. Every time he sees his new best friend, he will be reminded of the consequences of his lie. But the memory of our sin and its consequences are not always all bad. It is one of the things that keeps us from sinning again. We should be able to look back at our sin and especially the consequences and say, I can't do that again. It is painful, yeah. But is it effective? Absolutely. When we forget the past, we are doomed to repeat it. And that's what America is trying to do, is erase the past. And all that's going to do is we're going to repeat the same sins of the past. We don't want to do that, and we certainly don't want to do that in our own lives either. But friends, unfortunately, we will all falter in our faith at some point of time in our lives, and unfortunately, way too often as well. But friends, faltering in our faith does not necessarily have to equate with failing in our faith. Someone much smarter than I once said that failure is simply not getting back up after you fall. That is so true. Similarly, if when you falter in your faith, we will simply practice these three biblical principles, we do not need to wallow in failure. Rather, as God forgives us our sin, we can return to faithful service. So when you falter in your faith, confront the cause of your faith, consider the consequences of your faith, and confess, consequences of your sin, confront the cause of your sin, consider the consequences of your sin, and confess your sin. But then sin and go no more, of course, or go and sin no more. And of course, another biblical principle to practice when you falter in your faith is to be sure to be right back here next Sunday morning as we continue our continuing Bible study series on the life lessons so we can learn from the life of David, as we learn from the life of David in 1 Samuel chapter 23 through 30, how to defeat depression. And I think that's a pretty important lesson that we can learn from David. We all experience some form of depression in our lives at different times and for different reasons. But one of the greatest gifts that God has given us is the peace of God which passeth all understanding. Doesn't matter how bad life may seem around us, God is still good, and we have no need to be depressed when we have the love of God in our lives. So be sure to be right back here next Sunday morning as we learn how to defeat depression, just like